Welcome back to the show. Today we have Reece Sullivan, and he's a writer and musician. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what got you interested in this whole kind of Shakespearean topic?
Yeah, well, like you said, I write music and kind of a monomaniac with that. I've certainly been obsessed with certain writers. I went through a long phase of reading um, autobiographies on some major artists or writers.
Hmm.
And I remember coming to Shakespeare as part of that. This sounds real. Um, I sometimes say if you're writing lyrics, one of the best ways to pull yourself out of your normal little dumb, uh, you know, kind of rough lyrics that you're writing or the same little rut that you get stuck in or phrases or ways of thinking is to read some legit poetry in the sense of Bukowski, in the sense that he would say, 99.9% is junk. And I think when you look at it that way, it eliminates that sort of hoity-toity, this kind of, oh, this is supposed to be good factor, because now you're simply looking at it as you're looking at it artistically, but there's something of direct use. So anyway, that's kind of a lead in. Part of that, I remember hearing that people didn't really know much about Shakespeare. And back then, say this would have been in the early 2000s to 2005. I have memories of reading a lot of these biographies. And I don't know if that's when I heard that about Shakespeare, but at the time, I certainly, when I was first hearing about anything about his personal life, I thought, well, why would you know something? What would we know about a writer that was writing in the late 1500s?
Hmm.
So then jump to 2006, I got married, and my we had just gotten, I remember this, I remember where we were going. We just got married, and my wife said something about a book that she had come in contact with that said that whoever wrote these works was not the man from Stratford. And so from here on out, I either call him the man from Stratford or else Shakespeare, because he spelled his name, or someone spelled his name, multiple ways. It was almost always some form of Shakespeare, and the difference in spellings. Some people seem to think maybe that was someone in a court somewhere having to write his name for him, and so they just use different spellings based on how
Yeah.
it's pronounced. And those six signatures, even if we assume they're his, which we can't even really assume, that would be the only thing we have in the man from Stratford's, you know, that we know is from him. So anyway, when I
Yeah,
heard
the
that from her,
examples of his handwriting, right? There's only six, and
that's
they're all
right.
just signatures.
Yep, they're like a step away from an X. You know what I mean? As far as signing
Yeah.
your name.
Yeah, I've actually heard them described as like they're all different, right?
Yeah, there was a handwriting. I mean, I haven't looked into this, but yes, I've read that there was a handwriting expert that looked at those six signatures. Now I don't know who this was, but said that they looked like they were written by different people. And
Hmm.
anybody can look these up for themselves and look at the picture. And for what it's worth, we have god awful handwriting now. People back in the day could, they were more intelligent than I think we give credit. And of course, they relied, if they could write, on writing to convey ideas. They were normally very good at that. And a lot of times their handwriting was insanely good. And
Yeah.
this with Shakespeare, you know, the mainstream has to it look they the signatures look so bad they have to resort to things like, well, he had something like Parkinson's.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah.
mix the Parkinson's with the fucking bird feather or whatever. It's got to be like hard, like to have consistency. But yeah, it's so
Yes.
funny.
Yeah, so but anyway, just to sum that up, after she told me, I thought, well, that's interesting. And I didn't really, aside from having known that they were lying about the Iraq War, even though no one else around me, left or right, agreed with that, I wasn't into conspiracy proper. I didn't
Yeah.
believe. I still kind of default. I still thought that academia and the mainstream, there was someone behind that curtain that knew something, that had a reason to be saying. So at the time, I read a little bit, and of course, it's all dismissive, and you're left to think, oh, there's nothing to this. And So to sum there, just very briefly, after finding 9/11, a couple years later, I, over the next few years, just dove into a bunch of things, and I went back to this Shakespeare thing. I thought, well, maybe there is something to it.
Mhm.
Um, and I read a lot of stuff. I read several books. I read some essays, and yeah, it's really intriguing. It's really intriguing stuff to me.
So when you kind of started digging in, what were some of the first things you found that was like, hey, this isn't necessarily right? And then kind of where did that lead you to, and who did that lead you to?
Yeah, so um, well, I wouldn't make a secret of, I'm not making a secret of who I think it is. And it is the first person I read as a candidate,
Mhm.
though, which is Edward de Vere. He was an earl. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, so his name was first floated in the early 1920s by a man whose name was either pronounced Looney, which the mainstream people love to latch onto that and act like is this extreme. He's extremely intelligent in what he's, even if he was wrong, this isn't a dum dum here,
Yeah.
just spouting some nonsense. Or else it's pronounced Loney, and I hear different people pronounce it different ways. But so that's who I found, and I think the first book I read was Shakespeare by Another Name. I read several, and Shakespeare by Another Name, like being on a show like this and talking about it, I generally kind of class myself as a kind of expert layman, so kind of in this middle area. I probably know a lot more than people who don't know much, but I
Yeah.
certainly am no expert on the Tudors and everything going on at the time or exactly Edward de Vere's life. I haven't read all the plays. I was in love with the sonnets, but
Mhm.
so I'm kind of on this middle ground. And we can look at these reasons, but the quick version is, um, well, I'll take a moment longer than the quick version. Before Edward de Vere, the main candidate was Francis Bacon.
Mhm.
And there was a reason, and I don't want to be dismissive too much. Compared to the man from Stratford, Francis Bacon would be a wonderful guess. I mean, he would be a great candidate. He certainly was educated. We know that the man who wrote the works was smart. He was educated. He had read a lot of highbrow stuff. He
Mhm.
was familiar with a lot of things. He certainly seemed to be nobility in every way possible. And he knew some different languages. He could write fluently in those things. And he certainly seemed to know law very well. So a lot of that does fit Bacon. But the woman who mainly popularized him was a woman named Delia Bacon, oddly. Again, there's an odd, so no relationship, but it devolved into ciphers and codes, and
Yeah.
some people are into that. I'm not really too much. And certainly they wrote some cryptic things back then. They couldn't say tons of things because of the monarchy
Mhm.
and the nobility, and certainly a commoner couldn't. So, which we could get into some of that because that's interesting. Talking about Ben Jonson versus Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson versus Thomas Nash. Um, so the commoners, if they wrote something about, you couldn't even question who was in line to be the successor while Queen Elizabeth was queen. So this was a big deal. She had named a successor. This is just kind of one example, right? But and so the country wanted a successor named, and she wouldn't do it, and she wouldn't marry, and she certainly had kids, and this is another very strange thing, but you couldn't question those things, and so
Yeah.
someone like Ben Jonson went to jail twice for things he wrote, and one of the times he was writing with a man named Thomas Nash, a collaboration. He certainly seemed to be a nobleman. They wrote a play called Isle of Dogs, and it's the same with Shakespeare. There were things being said, there were people being ridiculed, and Ben Jonson was basically put in prison for this.
Okay.
But what happened to Thomas Nash? Well, nothing. The same with all the Shakespeare stuff. Shakespeare would have never.
Gotcha.
Yeah, the man from Stratford could have
So
never
what?
written. Yeah, sorry. Go
So,
ahead.
so was Ben Jonson like a commoner, or was he kind of a
Yeah,
nobility?
no, he was a commoner.
Ah, okay,
And
gotcha.
so now I've grown to really like Ben Jonson. And I also like the relationship that we know him and Edward de Vere had. So Ben Jonson, everything he's writing is from a commoner's view. So, like the people that he'll ridicule and give goofball names will be the nobility.
Mhm.
Whereas with Shakespeare, it's the complete opposite. All the heroes, all the people in the stories are nobility. And he gives these, some the goofball characters are commoners, and Shakespeare is fully pro feudal system. He's pro England. He's pro Tudor dynasty to an extreme degree,
Mhm.
and I mean I don't know enough to go into super great detail there, but you don't have to know a lot to understand why. Basically, it was a form of propaganda. I mean, it's beautiful. It's the most well written propaganda ever. And I don't even object to it on some level, but it was certainly pro Tudor dynasty. And uh, yeah, so there are these differences that you see just on the surface that show the commoner versus the nobility writers.
Yeah. So, what was Edward de Vere's role kind of in the Elizabeth court or society?
So yeah, he's born in 1550.
Mhm.
To begin with, even the mainstream, and to convolute this even more, this gets real hairy, and it's hard to just bounce on these huge topics with a sentence and then leave it.
Yeah.
But basically, Edward de Vere and Francis Bacon both appear to be sons of Queen Elizabeth. So
Wow.
changelings. And so she has these kids, bastard children, and puts them in other households to be raised. And then comes a point where Edward de Vere is receiving £1,000 a year. I wish I remembered the number in the modern day what that would be equivalent to, but it was an astronomical amount of money,
Yeah.
an inconceivable amount of money. And Queen Elizabeth was very, very, very tight with money. She wouldn't, if she was going to help a nobleman, she would normally give him a position and not just money.
Mhm.
And so, in connection with that, so again, Edward de Vere is born in 1550. Francis Bacon is born in 1561. He's about a half a generation younger. And the man from Stratford is born in 63, I think, or 64, about the same age as Bacon.
Okay.
And Edward de Vere dies in 1604. So he's 54, 53, 55 years old. And going back to the £1,000 he received a year, a man had said, I don't remember who he was, but he was someone that would know something. It wasn't just some nobody saying something.
Hmm.
Maybe around 1650 or 1660 that Shakespeare received £1,000 a year. Well, of course, Stratford didn't receive £1,000 a year at all. So we know Edward de Vere did, and what people like me who have looked at it, and pretty easy to conclude is that he's being paid to propagandize the public, and I could kind of speak to that, but
Yeah.
yeah, so part of it is most people can't read back then. The printing press is new,
Hmm.
and then Queen Elizabeth is now Protestant, and there are still factions that want Catholicism, and then the Pope or Rome, basically is against Queen Elizabeth and the Protestant England, and I don't know the details on this, but basically given some kind of go ahead on, they don't want her in power. And so for Queen Elizabeth to get her side out, she either has to rely on the theater or else say the Anglican church, the Protestant church.
Hmm.
There are no books, there's no television. The theater is the television. And so, that would have been the only real way that I guess I would know of, aside from the church, that's secular, to speak to the public, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know where that all started, where I was going with all that. So we had Commoner. What he does. So I don't really know where he initially had money. I'm sure he was given stuff by his quote father, who we don't know if it's really his father, the 16th Earl of Oxford. But I do know that he was very bad with money. He became known for being pretty bad with money, and he wound up in a pretty, I guess, dire position. But as part of that also, one of the things when I first found this, one of the most interesting parts, and now I doubt my initial conclusion, but so you have Queen Elizabeth. She won't name a successor. She's Queen of England,
Hmm.
and the most powerful man in all of England was William Cecil. And so initially, he was not nobility, but he was an advisor, and he's known for being this extremely shrewd, you know, cunning. My image is someone whose every decision in life, like who his daughter marries, of course, is all, and everybody would be that way. You're marrying your daughter or son off. You're arranging all that for certain types of alliances, for money,
Hmm.
for power, for leverage. Um, whose every move is based on that, and he was apparently very good at it. So his daughter is who Edward de Vere marries. Well, when I first found out that Edward de Vere was almost certainly the son of Queen Elizabeth, my first thought was William Cecil married his daughter off to him so that she might end up being queen when Queen Elizabeth dies and Edward de Vere becomes king. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As a major power play. You know what I mean? As to be father-in-law to the king
Hmm.
if Edward de Vere has a claim to the throne. So, yeah. Anyway, I can't remember where we were, but what he does to make money and this sort of thing. So I'm sure he had. I would have to think that with William Cecil and then Edward de Vere being his son-in-law, there was some disappointment. Um, and I think it's pretty clear that Edward de Vere was critical of William Cecil and certainly ridiculed him in the plays. So yeah.
Yeah. So
Anyway,
did Edward de Vere sit on Elizabeth's court?
well, I mean, I think he was all involved. I don't really know what it means to, as far as like, yeah, he was definitely part of the court.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, speaking of that, I mean, this is I'll kind of maybe use that as like a segue here.
Yeah.
I'm always worried I'm going to forget things because the amount of stuff here that points towards Edward de Vere writing Shakespeare is just overwhelming. It just there's almost no end to it, and it is very, very, very compelling and
Hmm.
very specific, down to life parallels in all sorts of ways. So, um, one of the first things, so leading into that, sitting on court, and I don't really know, what kind of power he had in terms of
Oh, yeah.
decisions.
It kind of
Yeah.
seems, yeah, I just looked up. It kind of seems like a similar role, kind of like Bacon. He wasn't like exactly on the court, but he was like a prominent courtier, I guess. That's what he was like looked at. Like he was still hanging around, he was still like involved, but not officially.
Yeah, and I think, and so part of this, I mean, I always worry how I come off because to me, in any kind of revisionist history or conspiracy circle, or the wonderful thing about this world to me, you're allowed to be wrong. You can speculate.
Yeah.
People can float all kinds of ideas, and that is how an intellectual ecosystem is meant to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather,
100%,
yes,
man. We're all human at the end of the day. And at the same time, we all kind of are guessing at this history. Like it is extremely hard to like nail anything down, really. I mean, with any
yes,
aspect of any of this conspiracy stuff because it's all just there's so many lies to it. So it's really hard to get a grasp on it. So man, that's the one thing I don't understand with everybody. Like when somebody gets one thing wrong, like people are gonna get a lot of things wrong at this, and
yes.
like, dude, that's okay, because at the end of the day, you're still weeding through all of that bullshit, and just to try to
Yeah,
find the truth. So.
yeah, there's a shift that occurs, the first one, two, three, or four, or five conspiracies that at one time you never thought could be true, you realize like, oh, there's either something to it or a lot to it, or it's almost certainly true. You still kind of think, of course, that most mainstream things are probably mostly correct. But then you pass a point where you say, I don't have any real place normally to really rely on 5 times a week 20 plus years ago. I thought that knowledge laid behind those doors. I was a 8-year college student. I have a half a degree in philosophy. I have a degree in anthropology, which is a science, even if soft science, and I more than almost an embarrassing amount. I used to think, that there was, and then at some point you realize like, oh, the whole publishing thing, that whole Barnes and Noble, all that 90, who knows how much of that information is false. So you land in a place where you don't know what to, you have to, there's a square one aspect.
Hmm.
But what I was going to say though is in an opposite direction. There's I'm a big fan of Richard D. Hall. In fact, as far as conspiracy, any form of I say alternative information, just as a phrase I would generally use. That guy is a treasure trove of stuff that people here in America I don't hear talk about as much. Like he has a lot of fresh new things. I can just hardly praise him enough.
Yeah,
But
I have to check
one
them
of
out.
oh man, it's so good. Everything, he's kind of funny in his own way. Because, but anyway, yeah, there's a lot to check out there, and it's hard to even know where to tell someone to dive in. But part of that is what I was going to say is one of
Hmm.
his main compadres, a guy named Andrew Johnson. So these are English guys. Andrew Johnson is this is a very thoughtful but complete. They go into all kinds of wild stuff, but there's a certain sense of classical intellectual. I mean, they have some rigor. They're not. I think they're kind of a perfect mix. But Andrew Johnson will say with certain things, he's like, you know, basically what he's saying in my words is that we consider it a virtue to say, I'm not sure, I'm open minded, we don't
Yeah.
know about this. A lot of things could be, but there's a point where that's not. I don't think that's true. We know 9/11's an inside job. I mean, there's not any debate about that at
Yeah.
all. It's
100%.
yeah, it's disingenuous to say that. I do have the same attitude about Stratford. For
Hmm.
me, I'm like, there's not any question. It's not him. I mean,
Yeah.
we can move to, people can, not we, but the general we can move to Francis Bacon or Edward de Vere. So there's certain things I hate to come off heavy, sounding, but
Oh
I know
no.
it's not Stratford. That's not that man. We
Yeah.
know only academia is left thinking
Yeah.
that, basically.
100%.
So
Yeah, exactly. Kind of,
any,
well, it's kind of like it's the same people that believe like 9/11 was the actual like the Saudi Arabians or whatever,
oh yeah,
and that it was real and that it's kind of funny. It's like it's kind of those same people, the people that went to college and are obsessed with the theater shit and
yeah,
kind of got indoctrinated by, you know,
completely.
by the public school system. So
Yes. I mean, I was indoctrinated too, I guess, at some point, but
oh,
I don't know.
100% was an NPC for, a portion of my life until,
Sure.
some shit happened and you wake up. But yeah, I definitely
Yeah.
understand.
What was the first thing that occurred with you that made you question?
Probably 9/11, man.
Yeah.
Like I was young too. And like I had a buddy at a sleepover show me like I think it was Loose Change, like the documentary. Like,
Yeah.
and I was like, holy shit, dude. I was young. I was like maybe in middle school or something.
Yeah.
That or like ninth grade. Yeah, it blew my mind. I was like, damn, I just like couldn't believe anything like that could be like possible, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
There was just so much to it. I was like, this is like so much evidence, you know,
Yeah.
against the mainstream claim that's very convincing, So,
What's so crazy? And I'll go back to Edward de Vere, and I
hmm.
know where I was left off, but yeah, just I find it fascinating. It's there's a, we use a phrase like cognitive dissonance, where no matter the level of what we're shown, evidence, information, data, some part of us at some point, maybe now with certain things or not with a lot of things, certainly in the mainstream, there's an amount where it doesn't matter how much you show them. And we use the phrase, well, there's cognitive dissonance. It doesn't. And yeah, that one of the best examples of that cognitive dissonance with me was, it's so odd for me to think back on it because it was probably just a few months after 9/11. It was maybe 2002. And it was the French dude that put out that little video about the Pentagon hit. And the strange thing is, my sister, who she sent me this video, and she certainly at the time was not conspiratorial at all. And her and my mom thought I was conspiratorial because I thought the wars were phony. You know what I mean? So, and to me, I was
Yeah.
like, well, no, I'm not a conspiracist because I think these wars are phony. But what's so crazy is, I sat there and watched that and the video of the Pentagon, and I still had some way um, to make it where it still wasn't basically a nefarious type conspiracy. I thought, well, maybe they shot a missile as the plane was going in, and that's understandable because that's what you would do. And it just happened to go into the Pentagon at that very moment. They just caught up with them right there. Of course, that's crazy, really. That's even crazier than all of it. But I don't know. I thought about that every now and then. I'm like, I can't believe I didn't just immediately go, oh my God. So
Yeah.
anyway, so yeah, back to his place in the court. What I was gonna say, one of the main things, these aren't just general things that why I think that Edward de Vere wrote them. They're very, very, very specific things concerning where he was, what information, what books he had access to, the people he was around, and then these details in all these plays. So one of those is in the play All's Well That Ends Well. The main character is Bertram, and he's a count. So a count is a French equivalent of an earl. And Bertram's father dies at a very young age, and he is escorted to the court with a huge line of horses to be put in the custody of the court to be educated. And so, what happened to Edward de Vere? Well, the 16th Earl of Oxford, his dad, or his the man who raised him, died, I think, when he was 12 or 13.
Hmm.
And what happens? He's immediately escorted to the court with like maybe over 100 horses, and to be put in the custody of the court as a ward, basically to be raised and educated.
Hmm.
So there are multiple things in All's Well That Ends Well, but already you can see, and that's exactly what happened to Edward de Vere is showing up exactly in that play, just
Oh
a
wow.
different name. Yeah. Um,
So did De Vere and Bacon kind of have a close public relationship, or did they kind of keep that secret? And do you know if they knew that they were brothers?
I don't know. And my guess, so I don't know if they knew they were brothers.
Well, I'm
It's
sure like if they did, like seeing like the whole aspect of them being hidden children of Elizabeth, I could see why like they would go out of their way to hide that.
sure. Yeah, and maybe there would be some kind of deeper you know, sense of closeness, or some kind of connection to knowing that they're
Yeah.
basically hidden children of the queen. That would surely produce something. But and I haven't really thought to look at, say, the relationship between those two.
Hmm.
My guess would be though that, and I don't know, I'm guessing here from another level, from just a speculation on what I've known about Edward de Vere and what little I know about Francis Bacon. But I would have a hard time thinking they were totally, you know, compadres, because I think there's a right brain, left brain difference between the two.
Oh wow.
I see Francis Bacon as being much more sciencey, and
Mhm.
logic based. And I mean, there are definitely things I like about him. But Edward de Vere being more, partier, wild, probably. Um, I think there are a lot of things that say that about him. Um, a lot of people have said that he was gay and had I mean that's a big story, that's a big thing of itself, unto its own. And I don't really totally know, but there are definitely reasons to
Yeah.
think that.
Well, I've heard
So,
that also kind of about Francis Bacon, even though he married at one point. I heard that he was kind of closeted in a way,
yeah,
rumored to have been.
yeah,
It's kind of weird the parallel between those two, you know?
I know. Yeah, I know. Yeah, both of them also, so Edward de Vere was accused of pederasty, I believe, when he was in Italy. And, but it's a very hard thing. I mean, I could totally see that being possible. But in the case of the accusation, I think the people had a axe to grind, and it looks, maybe, I'm not an expert on this situation, but they had like two people that they were trying to get to say, he had either had sex with or cornered or something, and one of them wouldn't do it. So, it's hard to know if that's
Yeah.
because Edward de Vere had power. He was the most powerful earl for a moment, and I'm sure he always had power over, compared to a lot of other people,
Hmm.
or if it's because he really didn't do it, so. But I do think there are reasons to think he was gay, but or I mean, about bisexual, I guess, if you will. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But speaking of, so I'll just, if it's cool with you, if we got open space, I'll
Yeah.
go through a few more of these. I go, they're so endless. I only worry that if someone's unfamiliar with it and they're slightly interested, I won't give enough of the kind of smoking gun things, or I'll forget things. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
back
Come
on
on with it. Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah. So all's well that ends well. Yeah, back to his marriage to Anne Cecil. At first, he clearly seemed to despise Anne Cecil, and he didn't want to marry her to begin with. For one, one was because she wasn't nobility. She didn't have a title or a position. And so the same in All's Well That Ends Well. Bertram is married off to a woman that he didn't want to marry, who didn't have a position. And as part of that, I guess as part of the arrangement, Queen Elizabeth moved the Cecil. She basically gave the Cecils a whatever you would call it, a title. Basically, moved them on some level to some form of nobility. And then Edward de Vere marries Anne Cecil. The same is happening in All's Well That Ends Well. And then also, this is even more. There are multiple plays, and to me, this is a very compelling thing. So, Edward de Vere refuses to bed Anne Cecil. Like,
Hmm.
he won't consummate the marriage, which is strange terms to use in today's world. But and he runs off to Italy. Oxford and Anne remain childless for several years before he also. Okay, so basically the same thing with Bertram in All's Well That Ends Well as Oxford. They run off to Italy without consummating the marriage, and yeah, so it's kind of an exact parallel. And then one more thing about All's Well That Ends Well.
Hmm.
So, and I'll just read this because I
Yeah.
have all these notes and try to make a little use of them and not feel like I'm. But
Hmm.
Bertram is tricked into sleeping with Helena when she switches place with another woman. So the way I guess I know this is ridiculous sounding, but so I guess the way this worked, there was a thing in the day called the bed trick where I guess a mistress is about to get in bed with you and y'all are going to have sex, and that mistress gets switched out with your wife or whoever, and now
Yeah.
you have sex with this person and you don't know. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, so Bertram is tricked into sleeping with Helena when she switches place with another woman. This is called the bed trick. Oxford allegedly, now whether it happened or not, but is another story. But it was said that it happened, and that's really all that matters. But Oxford allegedly fell for the same trick when Anne switched places with Oxford's mistress, and they begat a daughter. So the story is exactly the same. I don't know if the bed trick really happened, but
Yeah.
the story of Oxford and the story of Bertram are the same. And then just to kind of play on that same thing 1 second longer here, um, Bertram leaves for Italy. They haven't consummated the marriage. Oxford leaves for Italy. He's been years, I guess, without having sex with Anne. Apparently, they did have sex right before he leaves for Italy, and Anne
Mhm.
Cecil has a daughter. Um, so anyway, so he refused to live with Anne for 5 years. They reconciled later and had several more daughters. But so basically, Anne was completely faithful to Edward de Vere, and he later recognizes his daughters as his daughters. But there was a moment where he didn't. He kept saying that Anne has cheated on him, and that's not his daughter. Right. So in A Winter's Tale, the insanely jealous king of Sicily wrongfully accuses his wife of infidelity and denies paternity of his daughter. When Oxford denied paternity of his daughter, the Countess of Suffolk hatched the idea that the baby be presented to Oxford without telling him that it's his daughter. So the plan is they're going to put his daughter with him without saying who it is. And they hope that some kind of internal spiritual or paternal spiritual thing kicks in and he takes to the daughter and is endeared to her, and then they say this is your daughter, and hope that he can tell on some deeper level.
Damn.
So they do the same thing with the king in The Winter's Tale. And then also, so the same thing, Edward de Vere, after all of this, after basically um, being very cruel, I take it, to Anne, later extremely regrets all this and feels horrible guilt. So the same in both of those. And then in Cymbeline, a young nobleman hears of his wife's infidelity. And this is the important part. While traveling in Italy, he returns seeking revenge and then later begs for forgiveness. So that's exactly what Edward de
Damn.
Vere did. And then in Othello, the jealous Moor kills his wife after hearing a rumor of her infidelity. He regrets his actions after discovering her innocence. So the same theme, more or less, in four plays in various versions of the exact thing that happened between Edward de Vere and Anne Cecil. And so, and of course, Anne Cecil dies when she's 31. So I think that added to his guilt, and those plays I would assume are probably written. Well, I don't know that we totally know that, but I would think as he was a little bit older, long enough to have been through all that and felt this tremendous guilt or whatever. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
so
as like a parent, you kind of have these like reflective moments as you kind of get older like that. So I can see that. And to your point, like as a writer and like musician, like you kind of often write about what you know. So
yeah,
that's exactly kind of what he was possibly doing there, you know? I mean,
yeah,
it makes a ton of sense.
yeah, yeah. I think yeah, we all have to write about what we know. Man, I had a big breaking point for me, and I don't. I mean, I feel kind of weird talking about it because it feels like I'm, maybe it sounds like I'm praising myself. I'm not really meaning to do that, but in my 20s and in my late teens, I wrote an unbelievable amount, but the lyrics were just painfully god awful, atrocious sometimes because I kind of didn't care too much. To me, there was a melody over chords and there was production, and those were much whatever. And so when I was about 28, I was like, well, I'm starting all this over. And that's also when I started reading a lot more poetry, and I was reading these biographies on some multiple poets, and Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan and a bunch of different people. Willie Nelson
Yeah,
also.
Bob Dylan's one of
Yes.
my favorite
Oh man.
songwriters of all time.
Oh yeah, for sure. He's probably had a bigger impact musically. Maybe Willie Nelson, Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Merle Haggard now
Yeah. You
at
kind of
their
look
age,
like
but
Lucas Nelson in a way. You kind of give off that vibe.
okay. I've
I can,
seen Lucas play.
yeah,
Yeah.
same man. He's awesome, dude. Promise of the Real. That's some good shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw him play at House of Blues, open for his dad. This was probably 13, 14, 15 years ago. House of
Oh,
Blues in New Orleans.
yeah.
And he's killing it. He's just murdering it. And Willie Nelson got up there, and Willie Nelson was already old then. He was probably late
Yeah.
70s or 80. And I remember thinking, oh no, Willie Nelson started, and it was not very great.
Yeah.
And after a few songs, it just kind of launches off, and suddenly you're like, oh, this is good. This is real good. So he certainly found that spot. But then later, I was outside, and two things. Dan Aykroyd came out, and I thought, that looks like fucking Dan Aykroyd. What is Dan Aykroyd doing here? He's walking with Willie Nelson to the bus. And then I realized Dan Aykroyd owns the House of Blues in New Orleans.
Wasn't he a blues brother?
Yeah,
Holy shit,
yeah,
yeah. So a little tired of the blues. It's kind of wild, man.
that is wild. And then the next part is his sister Bobby, who played piano with him her whole life. She died a few years ago. She walked out and just no one knew it was her and took off around the block walking like 90 fucking miles an hour. And she was old. She was very old.
Yeah.
And I took off walking beside her. And not many people make, my two very starstruck, but I don't know. I couldn't help it. And I didn't bother her for long, but I just tried to say I loved her piano playing. And my son was born with Redheaded Stranger playing.
Wow.
Speaking of Redheaded Stranger, and so I told her that, and I said, so basically, I was like trying to say your piano playing was you were playing piano basically when my son was born, and I think you're great. And she finally slowed down and kind of said thank you on some level. Then I let her, I left her alone and walked off. So
So I guess back to Devere, you said kind of reading some of that stuff helps you write. What was kind of some of the stuff that kind of inspires you? And do you find like Devere's writing kind of inspiring as well?
he published poems, which this is another point.
Hmm.
And some people, the mainstream, will try to come at this and they'll say some of the early poems of Edward de Vere are way below Shakespeare, and I'm sure they are, and I haven't read those. But the difference in age, I just don't think that means anything. He was also credited with writing the first Shakespearean sonnet, literally under the name Edward de Vere. And so he's writing poems, and I think that he did write some, we could say he probably wrote some like juvenile plays, like at a very early age. Even people can point to some events and for good reason. I mean, this isn't just total speculation.
Yeah.
Like there's an event where, like a boys group, I think that he's part of, either put on some sort of an act. They have a shipwrecked ship, and Edward de Vere pops out of it as a very young, I guess, boy. I mean, I don't think super young child, but a very young youth, and gives Queen Elizabeth like a ring or some kind of so like a ruby or something like that. Basically,
Yeah.
yeah. And then a woman writes later about a play that she saw these kids doing, and this isn't conclusive, but and talks about maybe a monster involved. And I haven't read The Tempest, but it basically sounds like in some of the early ideas that could have been what became The Tempest. Now, I think The Tempest also is a separate category of stuff, but yeah. So then also his Edward de Vere's both of his uncles are credited with pioneering the Shakespearean sonnet, and I believe that's even mainstream. And so I think
Really.
they did this, and then they later realized that you know
Yeah. Oh shit.
yeah, Edward de Vere takes over. There's another thing. There are these two writers. One's named John Lilly, and
Mm.
another named Anthony Munday. And so again, this is why Shakespeare's birth in 63 or 64, I think, is important. So they said that John Lilly and Anthony Munday were inspiration for Shakespeare. The mainstream concedes this, right? Well, it turns out that those two men were servants of Edward de Vere, and they just wrote. So what it
Oh
looks like
wow.
is, yeah, Edward de Vere was Shakespeare, and they were just around some of this, and they also wrote. And so it was him that was influencing them, not them that was influencing Shakespeare. And so the age thing matters there. Yeah, and some other weird little things like that I think are compelling. His uncle was translating the Metamorphosis, and so you learn a bunch of things about just adjunct information you wouldn't know otherwise. Like there are almost no copies of. There are lots of things where they're not available to everybody, even the nobility. So
Mhm.
his uncle's translating Metamorphosis, and people later commented that I can't remember if his name was Golding. I think it was that people
Mhm.
said, well, Shakespeare must have surely had memorized this copy. Like he's pulling from that version of the Metamorphosis so heavily that he almost knew it by heart. Well, of course, Shakespeare would have never been able to get his hands on this book ever.
Yeah.
So, but this is Edward de Vere's uncle that is literally translating it. Yeah. So another thing, there's a book that Hamlet carries around on stage,
Hmm.
and again, I don't think this is very contentious to say that it's understood that it's very likely the book is called Cardonimus's Comfort.
Hmm.
So this that's not named in the play, right? But he's carrying this book, and there are enough passages that it certainly seems very connected. And a lot of people agree that that is the book that Hamlet has in his hand. Well, Edward de Vere loved this book so much that when he was 23, he paid personally to have it translated from Italian into English, and he wrote like an introductory
Damn.
thing to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then one other example of that along those lines, I think the mainstream has somewhat, and I'm not an expert. I couldn't. I don't mean to sound like I am so deeply into this that I
Well, I don't even think the
complete.
experts are really experts anymore, you
Oh
know?
no, they're
So,
not. Yeah,
well, the
but
ones that consider themselves or the mainstream considers experts, I mean, technically they kind of know nothing if they just believe a gigantic lie, you know?
dude, I saw a video the other day. I can't remember what it was. It may have been on something like methylene blue or something, which I'm agnostic. I don't know about it, yay or nay. I bought some, but I don't
I'm
know
not
that
sure.
that's
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm aware of what that is.
It's like it used to be a dye, but some people say it has these really great health benefits. I by no means think that, nor am I dismissive. I mean, I'm open to it.
Uh,
But a guy had a video. He's like expert way, expert tells his. I'm just like it's just so off putting.
yeah.
It's so off putting. When I even see that title, I'm just like I don't
Yeah.
I don't know that I want to hear. It reads too much like
Well,
expert.
after
Yeah.
kind of COVID happened, the experts proven wrong over and over again. I think it's just way too close to that time period for people to just
Yes.
fall hook, line, and sinker for anything like that again.
I hope.
If you're
Yeah.
thinking for yourself, I guess.
Yes.
But then again, I'm not judging anybody that
Mhm.
chooses to do the other thing.
Some people are oblivious still, as they don't really even know, but yeah. Um, yeah. So, what I was going to say is back to, the expert or whatever, but there's certainly been a huge, a lot of people talked about Beowulf and Hamlet,
Hmm.
but because the mainstream cannot put Beowulf in the hands of Shakespeare. So Beowulf is the first. I mean, it's written somewhere in Northern Europe, I think, or it's either written there or I've read a lot of highbrow literature, but I haven't read Beowulf.
Hmm.
But at any rate,
I've
it,
seen the
it's
terrible movie a long time ago that came out like 10 or 15 years ago, like the animation one.
okay,
I don't remember much from it, so.
yeah. I don't remember if I've even seen that. I probably would have given it a go, but
Yeah, I wasn't aware that it was like kind of from that like old time period either. I was an
I
idiot and I would probably got stoned and went to the movies.
yeah, no, that's what I would have done. Yeah, I mean, I was into that stuff kind of, but no, it's a lot older. But
Mhm.
I mean, it's maybe like I think it's hundreds of years older, but it's considered the first piece of English literature
Yeah.
ever written in the English language. So people have postulated on this huge connection of Beowulf and Shakespeare, but the academics can't connect Shakespeare with a copy of Beowulf because there's only one copy in all of England, and that copy was in Edward de Vere's house.
Damn.
So, yeah, so it's just I don't know, it's just to me it's kind of overwhelming. I don't know. It's fun to think about, and it's strange to think about. It's strange to realize even if neither one of us have read Beowulf, I mean, it's just such a common name. We could go anywhere. We
Hmm.
could get off this call and go read it on our phone. And to think that in all of England there was only one copy is just curious, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Was he known to like have a pretty large library?
I couldn't. I don't know about like a library size or anything like that,
Mhm.
personal, but without question, an avid reader.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're probably all those nobility dudes. I mean, I
Yeah,
can only imagine.
to have the only copy of Beowulf, man, so I would assume like he would have like some pretty cool like collection.
Yeah, yeah, I guess.
Use that
Yeah, for sure.
save up that allowance for quite a bit and just start balling out on some of these first editions, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's like the Cardonimus's comfort. He likes it, so he's a fucking earl. So he just says he pays someone to translate it. And
Yeah.
obviously, I guess he could read Italian, which that's a big subject, and Italy and Shakespeare. So, I guess he didn't feel that he was good enough at it to translate it properly. So
Mhm.
yeah, just like I like this book, I'm an earl. I'm going to pay you to translate it. So
Yeah.
that's yeah, and I guess back then when you consider that, you know, another little odd fact that I found out through all of this is that at the time in England there were what we would call like an encyclopedia. Like of a lot of like I guess Britannica, or I don't know if it was that big. I don't know how big they were, but there were
Yeah.
two encyclopedias in all of England that I'm aware of, and that's just an interesting fact. And it's interesting because the world, it just you realize how small the world was, and to know things at the time, yeah, you had to read about them. There's no other way to know, or
Yeah.
else someone had to tell you something. And um, I'm sure. I mean, when I was young, books seemed like a way to know everything, kind of, a way to,
Yeah.
whether it was philosophy or culture in some other place or whatever it was, yeah, this door behind which lays all these great things. Um,
It's been said like Shakespeare's had something to do with like the translation or the writing of the Bible, or he's kind of like tied to it. Have you ever heard of that? And do you think Vere was kind of behind that?
I don't know enough to really say.
There's like a Shakespeare, there's like a famous Shakespeare psalm, the Psalm 46, 46 words down from the top word it says shakes, and then 46 words from the bottom up it says spear.
Oh,
So they think it's like a little code within the Bible. I'm sure there's a ton more because people have been throwing like I guess the Bible through like AI
yeah,
language analyzing type
yeah,
software.
yeah. All I know about the Bible and Edward de Vere is, and I haven't looked into this much, but basically that his Bible is someone has it, and
Oh wow.
I mean, it discovered. I don't know how long they've had it, or if it was quote discovered late. I don't know what the details are, but apparently, so aside from like Metamorphosis, Beowulf, some of these other major works, I think it's understood that the biggest thing he would have pulled from and did pull from was the Bible. So people, the whatever his copy was, there's been a lot of talk amongst people who believe it's Edward de Vere. I guess like on the notes he wrote in the margins or things he underlined, if you will, you know what I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah.
kind of marked. But I don't know what those were, like any of the passages or anything. And then
Yeah.
I know that, of course, James succeeds Queen Elizabeth, and the King James Bible. I mean, I think that's him. Who so Queen Elizabeth died, I think, in 1603, and so James becomes king, and this is all a big event, huge, and it plays a major part in Edward de Vere and these different alliances, and and also King James was gay, but from what I understand, I mean, I don't know any
Yeah.
details about that, but yeah, and yeah, just an odd tidbit. I know I'm jumping around here, but I'll just mention this because it's so interesting. But Ben Jonson winds up back. I don't know if you say the tower. I don't know if they all went to the tower or they're different prisons. But so there's a whole thing going on with Ben Jonson. He's put in jail for Isle of Dogs, which is co-written with Thomas Nash, maybe in the late 1590s. And it looks like, okay, so then he gets out, and I think right after that he's in some sort of duel and he kills a man. And it's more speculation at this point, but people wouldn't testify against him, and he seemed to have some major legal help. And so people, it's not too wild to think that Edward de Vere, who was clearly friends with him, we know Edward de Vere was friends with Ben Jonson. And then there's also the speculation that Thomas Nash is Edward de Vere. And so, as a side note, Thomas Nash is writing kind of like a Elon Musk sock puppet on Twitter defending Elon Musk. You know what I mean? That's what
Mhm.
Thomas Nash is doing in part for Edward de Vere, and he's not arrested, and there's whatever. So Ben Jonson gets out of jail from Isle of Dogs. He kills a man. He seems to be getting help behind the scenes, even though he's a commoner, and that goes super well for him. And then Edward de Vere dies. And so Ben Jonson was this huge part in getting the Shakespeare stuff out. He also wrote the plaques on the wall in Stratford, which are very mysterious and coded. And
Yeah.
so this to me, I don't know, I find it endearing. It makes me like Ben Jonson and Edward de Vere and their relationship as friends. But someone tries to launch a smear campaign against us, and they write a poem, a play called Westward Ho, like Ho. I guess like heave ho. I don't know what that exact. I haven't read it. I don't know even, and I don't know how they're disparaging Edward de Vere. Ben Jonson fires back and writes another play called Eastward Ho, and this is called The War of the Poets or something like this.
Well, it's
But
like
in
a
Eastward Ho, he
Biggie and
is
Tupac kind of
yeah,
East versus.
that's right. Yeah, it's crazy. But in that, he's saying things either about King James or the King James court or the nobility in that circle, and that gets him thrown back in jail. So William Cecil, this powerful man, the father-in-law of Edward de Vere, has died, and Robert Cecil has taken over that same role, his son. And Ben Jonson wrote to Robert Cecil. It appears that Robert Cecil got him out of jail.
Hmm.
But then the curious part is within like maybe a few days of him being out of release from prison, he is seen having like cohorting and eating or something to that nature, hanging out with Guy Fawkes. And I don't know if you remember who that is, but that is the gunpowder plot, dude. So the gunpowder plot is a plot to blow up some part of uh, the nobility world, and I think he's a Catholic, and so they want Catholicism back in. They're against King James, and so what's curious is they're saying that Guy Fawkes was just had no real means to pull this off. So it reminds me of the feds and one dude that are trying to get to be a patriot and do something fucking crazy so they can crack down, or the Minnesota governor being kidnapped. I think even mainstream people contend that something fishy is going on here. And then it seems very curious that Ben Jonson, who's put in jail, and clearly he wouldn't want to be there, and now Robert Cecil's let him out, and to think that 2 or 3 days later he's going to betray him totally and go hang out with Guy Fawkes, who's planning this crazy, um, crazy deal. Yeah, so just to sum that up, and I'll wrap that up. But from that point on, Ben Jonson is pushing this Shakespeare stuff maybe behind the curtain because Edward de Vere represented a different faction that didn't want King James. And it also gets further complicated because Queen Elizabeth and Edward de Vere may have had a son, Henry
Hmm.
Roseley, the Earl of Southampton, who would have been heir to the throne, and Edward de Vere's son incestuously, but at any rate, he was definitely in a different
Holy
faction.
shit.
Yeah, and so then the plays are published in 23. So the sonnets are published in 1615 with Ben Jonson's publisher, and then the plays are published in 1623, And though they don't say Edward de Vere, they're still saying Shakespeare, and this kind of cements this. The two people that financed it were both, one was Edward de Vere's son-in-law, and the other married his another daughter. So they're
Hmm.
both basically son-in-laws of Edward de Vere, financing the release of these Shakespearean plays, which favor the Protestant Queen Elizabeth. And the other part of it was King James was allowing Spain to cede into the country. Sir Walter Raleigh was killed because Spain didn't like him.
Hmm.
And so that felt like a betrayal. In fact, there's a very parallel thing that everybody seems to be aware of now in the United States as far as who has ceded their whole way into this country in every way possible. And some people are, I think, rightly very against that. So I don't know that that's perfectly parallel to today's world and what's going on and has been going on for decades. But it's, I don't know, it comes to mind for me. So it would
Hmm.
be one reason to keep his name hidden, more than being gay or more than anything like that. If that's true, the
Yeah.
bigger reason would be because it's a threat to the crown, and you can't come in and start talking about other people that should have been king. That's a major no-no.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, that's bouncing all around there.
No, I mean, it's all relevant though, because
Yeah,
there are definite parallels. Not, I mean, like kind of like all throughout that society, even throughout the plays. So it seems like a lot of Shakespeare's work, or De Vere, if you will, uh, his work was kind of shaping the society against what the church was doing. It was kind of seen as a like a culture shift.
yeah. Yeah, what's weird to me, and where I another aspect that where I'm, at some point I realized, or I think my personal kind of little journey with certain things, it started with food. Um, and I find food interesting because it seems like this very simple thing, like what do you put in your mouth and chew up? What do you eat? And just the contention. And I sometimes will joke and say it's easier to talk religion or politics with people than what you should or shouldn't eat. And that's crazy, And so people, there's a staunch. But at any rate, that and cultural things, I became interested in, and I still am, in how people used to live, those sorts of things versus things that would, arguably break down society. What were artists like? Were they, you know, um, I don't know, how much wildness is allowed? I mean, how much, yeah, sexual deviation. And I don't even mean, I'm not even talking like homosexuality, but just cheating, or anything that in today's world, I now see from a certain vantage. I have two kids, and I feel like all of society is being broken down on purpose. And so you can't help but wonder, well, what did it used to be? What was it like 200 years ago, or four, or 1,000, or 5,000?
Hmm.
And yeah, so yeah, basically what you were saying, where um, yeah, it's not. A lot of it doesn't seem religious. It seems I don't know, secular and risque and stuff in a lot of ways. Yeah. So
Hmm.
anyway, yeah,
I mean, he in a way is a product of that that kind of deviant lifestyle, being a bastard child of a queen, kind of holding that secret throughout your life.
yeah, yeah. It's hard to figure all that out and understand, because I, I think a commoner that, I mean, some of those things, some of that stuff is just brutal. I mean, reading about, if I don't know that this is true, but there was like a little thing that was floating around on social media about in Germany hundreds of years back, if you wanted a divorce with your wife, y'all would have some kind of duel where you're like buried up to your waist in sand, and you have a certain weapon and she has another. Just crazy, batshit crazy stuff. But
Bring that back, by the way. No, I'm kidding.
yeah, so yeah, it's just weird thinking about all that. And then of course he's an elite, and so of course he could probably get away with all kinds of things. But yeah, playing off that a little. and slightly dovetailing in, um, a major part of Edward de Vere's life is going to Italy,
Mhm.
and he goes when he's like 25 or 26 or 27, and I think he's there for a little bit over a year. And I think um, that if a person simply looked at what happened in during his time in Italy, the places he went, the things we know he saw, and the things we certainly would think he would have seen in these major cities, the major works of art or cathedrals that he certainly would have been to, and how they all perfectly show up in all these plays, and they're all from those cities we know for a fact he went to. It's it's very incredible. There was a play, and the reason I think that came to mind for me is, and I didn't know this till this Edward de Vere stuff, but Venice was more a west, wild, it was a more anything goes type city, So I picture more whatever that is, prostitution, I don't know, crazier stuff than maybe would have been going on in England.
Yeah.
And yeah, so in Venice, there was an artist there, a major artist who would have been known as like a Picasso type, who has an entourage around him of artists and women or whatever. And he's this great artist, and he's painted um, Venus and Adonis, and Adonis has a bonnet, like a hat type thing on. Well, Shakespeare comes back. Well, we don't know when it's written exactly, but I think it came out in 93 or 94, but he writes Venus and Adonis, and in his version, Adonis has a bonnet on. Well, the only version of any kind of Adonis with this bonnet would have been the Titian painting, and the only place he could have seen it was there at Titian's house in Venice. And then he goes to some other places. He goes to Verona, which is where Romeo and Juliet is set, and Two Gentlemen of Verona is set, and there's some other
Hmm.
examples of the major art that was in Mantua that show up in his plays, and Padua.
Hmm.
And then of note, he goes to Siena. So we know we went to these places, and all these things are showing up in all the plays, the major artwork and
Yeah.
things. Also, the location of stuff, and um, down to very, very, very specific things that would not have been in those encyclopedias or on maps. He goes to Siena and he sees a play called The Deceived, and they show that every year on Twelfth Night. And everybody, under even the mainstream, concedes that Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night is based on The Deceived. So it's pretty
Wow.
tight stuff, in my opinion. And also in
Yeah.
Siena was a cathedral, and I don't know if it's like they're murals, but like the 12 ages or stages of man, and that shows up in As You Like It.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's that stuff's kind of endless. But then, of course, he's coming back from Italy, and his ship is robbed by pirates. And I think that even Edward de Vere says they're left on the shore, and he's naked and robbed by pirates. Well, in Hamlet, there's a scene. It's off stage, but there's a scene nevertheless of Hamlet being robbed by pirates and left on the seashore. So, and then you add in the stuff that he's fleed from Ancestral, the consummation of the marriage, the birth of the child. Just those 2 years in Italy alone, or however
Mhm.
long, from
Yeah.
going to Italy and coming back, and those events, I just think it's almost impossible. I don't, to look at that and not say, to do a double take on what's good, who wrote it, So anyway, yeah.
Yeah. The kind of information and proof kind of just keeps piling up as you
And
keep going. I mean,
well,
looking into it.
oh man, if any, I mean, yeah, like the book Shakespeare by Another Name is just this is a pretty, big book, and it's just endless, and everything I've read has been more or less, in the last few decades, written in the last few decades. And I've only come to understand recently that when this first came out in the 1920s, there was like a whole different group of, a whole different kind of scholarship. There were different things that they found that don't get talked about today. And so, Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe in the future, I'll go back and read some of those, at least one or two of those old books, and see what they were saying, why they were saying it was Edward de Vere.
Yeah,
So,
it's super interesting. Do you have any like other kind of points that you'd like to share?
well, I found this out recently. I'll just share it because it's interesting. But
Hmm.
there's there's a girl. She has a little YouTube channel, and I like her. Her YouTube channel is called Phoebe DeVere, and it's about Edward DeVere. But
Oh,
she has
cool.
a little video, and she talks about the basically the three deaths of Edward DeVere. There's the death, which also that's a big deal. Edward DeVere dies in 1604, and even all the mainstream Shakespeare people say something clearly happened in 1604 to his life. Something has changed. So all the plays had been coming out, and they would be noted as being updated and amended or revised, and all that stops in 1604. And then people start showing up saying they're writing Shakespearean plays that we all know were not written by Shakespeare. So the phonies show up.
Yeah.
And then this Westward Ho, Eastward Ho thing with Ben Jonson and this War of the Poets, and this being sparked off because Ben Jonson's defending Edward de Vere. Um, so that's the first death. The second death is because they're publishing the folio, and we assume it's because they don't want to interfere with King James and this successor question, and the Earl of Southampton being the heir to the throne, while King James is and so they had to keep Shakespeare as the author to even be able to publish it in that day.
Yeah.
But then what I'm getting to is this. She says, and I don't remember the details to this, but I'm just going to share one little interesting point. She says that the real cover up came later when the Shakespeare industry started, and she ties it to like Alexander Pope and some other main key players then.
Hmm.
And I haven't read a lot of Alexander Pope, but I have read a little, and I read some before knowing this, but like a couple years ago, and I really liked it. I thought it was pretty good. Um, but she seems to kind of disparaging. But anyway, she says, and she's not, despite this Edward de Vere thing, she's not a conspiracy theorist person. She
Hmm.
doesn't like I would be, but she's saying it's done by Freemasons. And this is
Oh,
from
wow.
a very kind of non-conspiratorial view. But at any rate, what I'm getting at is this: the final point I just put on this is later down the road. This would have been around the time of the American Revolution, I think, maybe the 1760s or something. They erect two statues of Shakespeare, one in Westminster Abbey and one in a house that I think was owned by Edward de Vere's son-in-law.
Hmm.
And I think they knew who wrote it for real, but they have him pointing. Shakespeare is taking a Rosicrucian or a Freemason pose. His legs are crossed and he's pointing, and he's pointing at a book that is quoting the Tempest, but it's misquoted, which is already curious. This is a statue, like a major.
Yeah.
This isn't just something they. This isn't just a drawing,
Might want
with
to
a
get the chisel right, bud. Like
correct.
Jesus Christ.
Yes. But what it seems to be is a code, like an intentional misquote. And his
Yeah.
finger is pointing at Solomon's temple,
Holy
that
shit.
phrase. And then in the house, I think it's pretty much the same statue. And he's pointing at Shadow Player.
Wait,
So I just,
what's Shadow Player?
well, I don't know. I don't know if it's them as like a double meaning thing where
Mhm.
they're the ones controlling the narrative, they're the shadow players, or it's that the writing of Shakespeare involves a shadow player.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, no, that
Yeah,
totally makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
Jeez.
I don't know, but I'm very curious. Yeah, it's just all that stuff's very crazy between the hidden authorship, the Guy Fawkes stuff, the Freemason stuff, the warring between those, uh, factions in the government or the monarch, who they want to be king.
Well, there's a lot behind the Freemasonry thing because I just had Ronnie Pontiac on the show last night and the whole Rosicrucians. Like, I guess Freemasonry is kind of like a spinoff from the Rosicrucians, or it kind of came from, or they were inspired by the Rosicrucians.
Okay.
And honestly, It's kind of interesting that they kind of carry I think a lot of these people like DeVere and Bacon and John Dee were a part of that Rosicrucian group, like the kind of first few eras of that, and it kind of carried on. I think this is why that type of writing, like the Shakespeare's writing, was so important to kind of carry on through these societies. Like you see Freemasonry bleeding over into America and being a part of like every city. They've got a
Yeah.
lodge, you know. And that writing is like such a huge thing that we focus on in this country. It's very, very interesting. There's a lot there, you know.
Yeah, man, it is weird that, in my little hometown of 17,000 people, there's a Freemason lodge just right downtown on the square. And
Mm.
I play a joint right beside it. I mean, I'm there.
Yeah,
I'm back in my hometown quite a bit. Of course, I grew up there, and I don't even remember anyone ever going in that building once. And of course, I don't know that I'm not saying anything nefarious is going on there,
I'm
but
sure like now it's like completely different from what it originally was, you know. It feels like that because it like a lot people are more open about it, it seems, that are involved with Freemasonry now.
it's weird. I mean, I don't. This is just a thought. Way I've tended to look at some of that starting more recently. And I spent a little spell trying to read about like Freemason beginnings. My dad's, I know some, like a weird lead in, but my dad's a bricklayer, so a
Hmm.
mason. And
Yeah.
so, I just read some of this from a more pedestrian thing, but it still seems conceivable, which was that they didn't have like a craftsman's lodge. They moved around and built cathedrals. And
Hmm.
so it was a more nebulous club, like before it becomes what we think of it. Like it may have been a legit just fraternity of just dudes that
Yeah.
were bricklayer, masons, and that somehow, it gets kind of co opted. And then there's this circle within a circle. But what I was finally getting at, and I don't know that this is true at all, but I can't help but think is that any group I would tend to think that even has a little bit of secrecy, like I see it like an energy or a spirit snaking through these groups, and they'll use anyone, and as it gets useless, they fall away. But they just their little
Hmm.
they seed into another group, and they use a circle within a circle in that, whether it's Rosicrucian or maybe I think that I don't know. I don't want to say, and I don't know where you or anybody falls on this. And I'm a product of my times,
Hmm.
which is a post ethnic or racial or any of that. I don't even in light. I'm pretty uncomfortable. I don't like talking about, um, you know. But anyway, there are certain, I think that certain ethnic group, an ethnic group, is kind of nebulous enough that a circle within a circle can easily form. And I think I just think that's one part of many that get co opted or
Hmm.
used. And yeah, I'm curious, and I would like to know more about the Rosicrucians back then.
Do you have a Spotify account?
Yeah,
I know it's a weird question, but
no,
they have audiobooks on there. I'm constantly just ripping through audiobooks nonstop. But I came across a book called Rosicrucian America by Stephen Sora. It has everything about any of this. It goes deep, dude.
hmm.
It's a super interesting read
I'm
or
get
listen, whatever.
yeah,
But
I'm gonna check it out. So you said Rosicrucian America?
hmm, yeah,
Okay, yeah.
definitely worth it.
What I mean, do you think like I mean, like I've heard. I mean, what do you think about the American Revolution? You think that's
Oh man,
organic or what we're told or not? I
dude,
mean,
I'm questioning everything because, like you said, like even so, starting like with 9/11, every major event in history is like lied about, like in a major way, every
I
single
know.
major event. So I have no reason to think like the revolution story is like accurate at all. But the one war that really stands out to me, and I've really been looking into recently, is the War of 1812. And there's so
Okay.
much weird shit going on, like in the early 1800s with Napoleon just like ripping through, you know, areas,
Yeah.
burning shit down for no reason, just being destructive for absolutely no reason and going home. pretty much with nothing anyway. It's very odd, and the same's kind of going on over in America. Like America kind of wages a war with the British again after the revolution, and when they're like extremely poor, they don't have many resources, they don't really have a military at all, and they're not put together well. Like they're not really set up to do it, and the British come in and just destroy a bunch of shit in a way and then leave. They just burn down a lot of like Washington, D.C. and then dip out without
It's
taking it back over, which they easily, at that point, like it seems like they easily could have taken it over.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah, that's the craziest thing ever. Yeah, that just came on my radar real very recently too. I'm like, yeah, it's batshit crazy. It reminds me, a few things, a few little things like I feel like I'm pretty close to right about that just
Hmm.
like dawned on me.
Yeah,
And I'm not saying they're really that spectacular, but I didn't have anybody tell. I don't remember anybody saying this to me. I just remember thinking at some point
that's
how
okay.
odd it is that all these monarchies and this ruling class that's been there absolutely forever. Suddenly, like if you read about the Irish potato, the Irish Holocaust, I mean, you just have a bunch of poor fucking farmers working 12 hours a day, kids in the fucking field, no way to communicate and about organizing a rebellion to bring in a democracy. I
Hmm.
mean, what are the chances that every one of those monarchies fell over the span that they did and all became democracies? And of course, yeah, I mean, I just think that's crazy that no one else has, it's not just a little bit more common for people to
Yeah.
question that. Yeah, the bankers can control the 4-year cycles and stuff much easier. There's a loyalty by blood that comes with things like monarchies and families ruling,
Hmm.
and I'm sure those people aren't for people like us. I'm sure there are a lot of things about the bankers ruling that are better for us. I don't doubt, but it's not a democracy. I don't believe that. It's not, that's never been, I just think they just did that so they can, maybe in the beginning there was a little bit of we elect this person or that person, or a republic, but where there's laws, but we elect the laws stay the same, but we elect a leader. And maybe we were electing some people a little more organically, but of course that probably went away really quick. I don't know when, but
Hmm.
looking across all those countries, the fall of the Tsar in Germany, that's uh, all of them. I mean, I just those, just to think, I just don't think all those poor people struggling to fucking eat can just say, in small group villages that they're going to have to get majorly organized weapons, enough food to go revolt. They're going to be
Hmm.
against all the lords, the landlords, all those earls, the whole monarchy. There's no
Yeah.
way all those countries could have overthrown all those monarchies. And so I just think money was put behind little weirdo rebellion groups and or whatever, whoever they needed or could fund. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, I think that whole thing down through that's what I think of when I think of, the 17 and 1800s. And I certainly don't know a lot about what,
Well, well,
yeah.
they might have just gotten like I see it maybe they might have just gotten smarter in a way to rule in like which like people don't see that they're kind of like tax slaves, to like a higher system, instead of, looking up to like a king or whatever.
There's always, you hope that if people could see at least just call it into question, I mean, no matter what any conspiracy, whether which is true or not, why wouldn't any common person say, even if it's not true, we're going to hold those people, if there's any suspicion of anything, we're going to press them against a wall and question them till that we get the truth. And if they turn out innocent, well, good, and we'll keep them in check that way. Wouldn't that be what you do? You don't just say, no, I'm sure that they're telling the truth about all of it. And they could, by just even being suspicious, that's a way of holding someone accountable.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, just not following along with like the mainstream narrative. after they've been kind of caught like lying repeatedly. Like we just mentioned throughout history, it's pretty insane. I mean, like they were able to control information like pretty damn easily. Um, you know, back in that time period, there wasn't really a good way to
Yeah.
the information out like the 17, 1800s, and there's just a that time period is just so interesting to look into because it's just a lot of crazy shit like America's history and how it starts, like the revolution, like you brought up. It's like we've been in constant war since the revolution, not just with other countries, but with the Native Americans. You're like fighting them off and doing all kinds of other shit. But on the back end, what's really not often talked about in history is like the Dutch East India Company coming over here and colonizing first. That was like
Oh.
they were an actual like huge entity that like had its own army that was bigger than the British Empire's army. I mean, they were a fucking big deal.
Hmm.
And yeah, I've been kind of doing a little bit more digging into their involvement over here in America, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, I wanted to read more about the East India Trading Company and the Committee of 300, which was in charge of that. And you're like, yeah, how does that go away? I mean, you can't. They were saying that the opium trade was producing more wealth. I can't remember the exact corporations they named, but they like said like a Ford, General Electric, all these major corporations in America, they were producing like three times that wealth in 1 year. And they're being governed by this committee of 300, and you're like, well, they don't just say we're done, I mean,
Yeah.
they just seed in, or they go hidden, or they something. I
They kind of veil themselves in another way. Like
Yeah.
they get smart with it. I mean, I just mentioned like you're not taught about the Dutch East India Company.
Yeah, I think Joe Atwill, you're familiar with him?
I don't think so.
Oh man, he's very interesting. And I feel like he's not like some dumb dude, but I swear I'd have to go back and find it. I think he talked about it on the podcast Skeptico, but
Mhm.
I swear he said the second century BC or third century. I mean,
Yeah.
like almost 2,000 years ago, they found like things here in America, like where there would have been little colonies, and all the coins were Roman coins from that time period, and they're all over the place. Like
Holy
these
shit.
people, yeah, I think they were Jewish, maybe Jewish from Rome, came here and lived. Yeah, wait a minute, I'll just say this though. Yeah, I held out for a long time. Things like giants, that's not really, that wasn't my inclination coming into this world, or like tall human beings.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the stuff in the Grand Canyon, the quotes from Abraham Lincoln. Another weird thing that I didn't know till recently is that, like the vanilla sky thing, whiting out the sky on all those pictures, that,
Yeah.
basically what we think of as graphic design and photo manipulation, there was apparently, and I may have seen which one it is, but they didn't do this recently. They were able to do this like at the dawn of the camera, I guess, where they could take his head and put it on someone else's body. Now,
Yeah.
I don't know how they did that, but
Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah. They
that's crazy,
One of
man.
his
I mean,
most favorite famous portraits. It's crazy when you look back at some of the most historic photos of this country. A lot of them have been manipulated like that, whether the sky is whited out or it's a different head on a different body, that type of thing, or it's just completely fake altogether. It's like a staged photo. Like you look through the actual photos from the Civil War, man, they're like the strangest pictures you'll ever see.
hmm.
There's a lot of other weird shit going on in the background, like too, which I mean,
Yeah,
but
you have to send me those if you come across
yeah,
them.
absolutely.
So
Well, man, I'll end it with that, man. I really, really appreciate your time. You have a really cool insight on everything, and I appreciate you sharing everything with us.
yeah, it was fun. No, I appreciate you having me on.
Listen close, it's the occult folk.